Mara Hale walked into the conquered hall with steady steps and a calm face. The chamber was vast, shaped like a ring of light and shadow, with hundreds of species seated in tiers of color and form. The air smelled faintly of ozone and stone from the life support mix. She felt the weight of every eye on her as she moved toward the center platform. Humans had endured years of insults, taxes, raids, and the quiet erasure of their dignity. The Concord session was supposed to be a place of law, but Mara knew it had become a theater of mockery. The Ural delegates unfurled their thin crests and made clicking greetings. The Joraxis envoy leaned back with a smirk on his armored face. The Dalian chorus hummed a low note of patience. Their hums were known to calm storms of words. Mara folded her hands behind her back and waited for the accusations to be read. The charges against Earth were repeated as they had been many times before. Tariffs raised without reason. Inspectors who damaged cargo and then fined captains for the damage. Convoys halted at the edge of Axis space, never seen again. The clerk finished and the Axis envoy spoke. He asked if humans had considered staying in their own shallow pond instead of trying to swim in deep water. His words drew chuckles from his allies. Mara did not flinch. She remembered the children she had seen in Ceres colonies riding mining carts, as if they were sleds laughing in thin air. She remembered the pebble an old man on Earth had given her, a simple stone from a cliff by the sea, telling her to carry it to the place beyond fear. She thought about her oath to keep peace as long as peace kept her people alive. She stepped forward and placed a slim slate on the pedestal. The slate held a treaty that could work safe lanes, clearly marked shared oversight of inspections, arbitration by neutral judges, restitution for lost ships, and a short window of amnesty, so old crimes would not choke new trade. She read the terms in plain words. The Dalian chorus hummed in approval. The neutral delegates flashed quiet signals of interest. The Axis envoy clicked in contempt. The Ural tried to act above the matter, but their crest shivered slightly. Mara ended with words that cut the laughter. Earth will accept this as the final compromise. If one more human convoy is harmed, the answer will be decisive and swift. The chamber froze. The word decisive had never sounded so sharp before. The Axis envoy let out a hiss that echoed off the walls. He said patience was another name for weakness, that the conquered could not be forced by a minor species of soft bones and wet worlds. His laughter spread among his allies, but it faltered when the Dalian chorus lowered to a warning note. The chair called a recess and the chamber broke into murmurs. Mara left the platform and stood by a high window. The spindle of the station spun below. The Sarika Nebula stretched across space like spilled milk on velvet. Her breath was slow, steady. On her wrist, a message from Earth pulsed, a single glyph, a circle inside a square. It meant the same words every child on Earth knew. Hold the line until the line is crossed. She thought of her father teaching her to sail. Patience with rope, patience. With wind, patience. With storms, he told her patience was not standing still. Patience was moving at the right time. Delegates clustered and whispered. The markets in the lower decks buzzed with gossip about human carriers that now moved with unseen. Escorts, convoys no longer traveled alone. Rumors spoke of shadows in the lanes and fleets with no flags. Mara returned to her place at the center when the chair reconvened. The chair was a living cloud encased in a lattice of crystal. It had presided over conquered sessions longer than most empires had existed. It thanked Mara for her clarity and turned to the Axis for a counteroffer. The Axis envoy sneered and offered the same demands as before. Disarm escorts, accept random seizures, let Axis judges rule on human captains. The chair dismissed the list as unfit and called for mediation. Mara accepted 72 hours of talks. She announced that during those hours, no convoy would sail. She promised to share the draft treaty with every neutral market so all could see what peace looked like. She would answer questions from any delegate and would even show the inspection codes humans used on themselves, so no one could waste time shouting about secrecy. She asked for one thing in return: that no ship bearing the blue lantern of relief be touched, because food and medicine were not tools for bargaining. The Dalian chorus rose at that, and their harmonics covered the hall in warmth. The chair marked the request as binding unless rejected. The Axis envoy said nothing, but his eyes narrowed. When the session closed, Mara chose the public corridor instead of the secure one. She walked past merchants who had never seen a blue sky, past cadets still amazed by the spin of artificial gravity. She let them see her calm face. A human who had not come to kneel but had not come to snarl either. In her quarters, she placed the small pebble from Earth on the table. She whispered to it as if to a friend. There are places beyond fear. Poured tea, watched the steam rise, and sent 2 messages. One to the fleet at Lagrange 1. Keep bells ready. Another to the relief agency on Thessaly. Hold departure for 72 hours. Then she lay down with the lights on and let her mind open to the dreams that came only when one dared to be seen by oneself. On the far side of the station, the Axis envoy recorded a private order to his captains. He told them to seize the next human relief convoy and broadcast the capture to the conquered. He believed patience was weakness. He told himself humans were bluffing. Yet as he closed his eyes, the last thing in his mind was the face of Mara Hale, calm without showing teeth but carrying the promise of a bite that might one day close the sky. The relief convoy bound for the quarantined colony of Thessaly moved quietly through the dark. It carried crates of medicine sealed in silver foam and food grown in the spinning rings above Mars. Every crate had the blue lantern symbol painted in bright dye, a sign that even in war and rivalry some things should pass untouched. The convoy captain was an older spacer named Jonah Reeve, who had survived asteroid storms and reactor leaks. He trusted the lantern. He trusted the Concord law that had protected aid ships for centuries. But as his vessels cleared the edge of Jor space, the stars shifted and heavy shadows fell across his screens. The Axis fleet rose from silence with weapons armed and orders clear. They hailed the convoy once, but their signal was mocking. They demanded surrender and claimed all cargo in the name of Axis security. Jonah replied that they carried relief. Not arms, that they had lawful escort codes, but the Axis commander ignored him. Boarding clamps struck metal hulls and hatches screamed open. The crews resisted, but they were not soldiers. They were aid workers and miners drafted to carry supplies. The Axis troopers streamed in dark armor and took them with stun pikes and iron grips. Children who had come as passengers, bound for families on Thessaly, cried as they were dragged before cameras. The Axis commander smiled into the lens and said to all watching that humans were weak and helpless, and that no Concord charter could save them from reality. The recording was sent across open channels to every relay on the rim on Earth. The transmission arrived without warning. It was night in many cities, but across the planet, people stopped where they were to watch the same images. Families gathered in silent rooms. Street crowds froze as screens shifted to show children seized and crews beaten. There was no shouting in those first minutes, only a still quiet that wrapped the world like a blanket. The silence was heavier than any cry. Then, without speeches, without orders, every fleet reserve moved into readiness as if the world itself had taken a single breath. Civilian networks shifted into crisis mode. Aid agencies shut down travel lanes. Volunteers appeared in command posts, waiting without being called. Mara Hale sat in her Concord quarters when the message reached her. She watched the Axis commander sneer into the lens. She watched Jonah Reeve pushed to the deck. She did not speak until the screen went dark. Then she opened the secure channel to the Concord and sent a message that was 1 sentence long. The line is crossed. The neutral delegates who saw the transmission felt their throats tighten. They had seen wars before, but never a people who met outrage with silence that looked like focus. The Dalian chorus raised a note of grief that carried across systems, and even they understood that grief was now folding into something harder. The chair of the Concord summoned emergency talks, but few believed the Axis had left any room for words. The seized convoy had been marked with the blue lantern, a sacred sign. In the long memory of the stars, to break it was not only a crime but an insult to the fabric of law itself. On the orbital docks above Earth, massive ships stirred. They were black-hulled cruisers that had been built quietly while diplomats smiled, and bowed ships that carried drones like swarms of hornets and weapons designed not for terror but for precision. The crews were not loud. They filed into place like men and women going to work in fields or factories. They checked systems with steady hands. They spoke of families and of duty, and they waited for the signal that had been prepared long ago. Human networks reached out across space not to boast but to calculate. Fuel routes were cut. Communication relays were marked for silence. Accounts that funded Axis fleets suddenly showed empty as human cyber teams pressed hidden keys. The first strokes of the answer were quiet ports that went dark, ledgers that vanished admirals who woke to find their fleets blind and hungry. In the homes and streets of Earth, people moved as if part of one body. They did not riot. They did not scream. They prepared farmers, sent grain stocks toward processing yards. Engineers opened old shipyards. Families wrote letters to crews who had not yet left, telling them to be strong but also to come home when it was over. The silence had become movement. Mara Hale stood once more in the Concorde chamber, this time, not to plead, but to let the hall feel the change in her presence. She repeated the same words she had spoken before with one change. The offer of compromise is ended. The answer begins now. The Axis envoys mocked again, but some of their allies shifted uneasily. They remembered the look in Mara's eyes from before. They remembered the silence of an entire world that did not break but only deepened. The galaxy did not know yet what shape the answer would take, but every delegate felt the moment as a hinge between patience and fire, a hinge that had turned forever. The silence that had held Earth for so long was broken not by shouts of vengeance but by the sound of fleets moving as one. Across the solar system, docks lit up like dawn, as ships that had been built under the shadow of patience stirred into life. These were not legends or mystical engines. They were human craft forged with steel and code, shaped by centuries of war and peace and the stubborn need to endure. The world had waded through insult and injury, but it had not wasted the time. Every year of mockery had been turned into practice, every delay into preparation. What the galaxy saw as slowness was in truth a long and steady sharpening of the blade at Lagrange 1. A lattice of drones unfolded like wings across the void. They were small, angular, and faceless, but in their millions they formed a living net no fleet could slip through. Each was armed with sting weapons precise enough to peel an engine from its mount without touching the hull beside it. Farther out at Saturn, the dark hulks of the black ships turned in formation. These vessels had been whispered about for years, dismissed as rumor, but now they revealed themselves with silent engines. They carried Marines whose training was not built on parades but on harsh survival drills in the most unforgiving places, men and women taught to fight in silence with precision and mercy, only when mercy was a choice. The first moves did not kill. The first moves blinded. The great banks of the Axis woke to find their ledgers empty, as if numbers had been burned away by light refineries that fed their fleets reported sudden failures. Supply chains that once flowed with certainty now twisted into dead ends. Admirals called for orders and received nothing, as communication nodes fell dark, hacked and silent. The galaxy watched with disbelief as the largest Axis fleet sat stranded like beasts with broken legs, unable to rise. Mara Hale stood at the Concorde once more, not as a petitioner, but as the witness of a promise kept. She did not raise her voice. She simply reported the facts. Axis fleets were blind. Axis ports were shut. Human convoys moved unchallenged. She said that patience had ended and that law would now be enforced not through talk, but through action. The Dalian chorus answered her words with a steady hum of sorrow for what had been forced upon them, but also with a subtle harmony of respect. Neutral delegates leaned forward because they could see that this was no bluff. Humanity had not come to destroy for glory. They had come to prove that a line meant something. The first clash came at the fortress of Vardun, a world ringed with guns and proud banners. Axis leaders had called it untouchable. Its walls were thick enough to burn fleets for weeks. Yet when the human forces arrived, they did not storm the walls. Instead, they cut every path leading in or out. They starved the fortress of power by cutting its external lines. They swarmed with drones that plucked weapons apart one by one, and when the guns fell silent, Marines descended not with fire but with calculated strikes. They moved through corridors like shadows, disabling controls, locking down command decks and capturing leaders alive. It was a siege, but it lasted less than an hour. and the galaxy stared in awe. News of the fall of Vardoon spread like lightning. What had been pride of three empires was now quiet under human command, and the remarkable truth was that not a single civilian quarter had been touched. Hospitals stood intact. Families walked free. Even rival merchants whispered that humans had achieved what no fleet had done in centuries: precision without cruelty. That was the moment when the galaxy began to understand that human patience had never been weakness. It had been the study of every insult. Every cut, every failure turned into knowledge and skill. The moment patience snapped, it revealed a blade honed beyond imagination. Axis propaganda tried to call it luck. They said Vardoon had fallen to betrayal, or cowardice. Yet captains across the stars whispered to each other about what they had seen. Entire fleets blinded overnight, fortress guns disabled without a battle, Marines who took control without mass killing. It was not luck. It was power with discipline, and that frightened them more than rage ever could. Back on Earth, families lit candles not as mourning but as a signal of resolve. They knew this was only the beginning. They knew more battles would follow. But they also knew that the time of waiting had ended. In every city, bells rang to mark the passage from patience to power. Across the stars, the message was clear. Humanity had moved, and nothing would ever be the same. The fortress at Vardoon had been more than a stronghold. It had been a symbol to the Axis and to the wider galaxy. It was the rock on which they had built their arrogance, its guns so vast they could strike ships before their crews even saw the horizon of the planet. Its walls were said to be layered with alloys, forged in dying suns, its hangars stuffed with fighters bred for nothing but war. For decades it had stood untouchable. Fleets had gathered around it and then scattered, knowing it was a bastion that none could ever hope to take. Yet when the humans came, the myth of Vardoon unraveled in less than the length of a single rotation. The battle began not with thunder, but with silence. Screens across the fortress flickered and went black one by one, like candles snuffed out. The Axis commanders screamed orders, but their voices carried into empty channels. Their fleets had already been cut from them. Fuel lines twisted into nothing, their fighters grounded without the codes to lift off. Even their mighty orbital batteries stood in darkness. Their systems had been learned, studied, and then dismantled as easily as a child's toy, before the humans even showed their faces. Then the drones came. 1,000,000 points of light swarming out of the void, weaving patterns that seemed like chaos but struck. With merciless intent, each drone carried weapons precise enough to slice a turret without touching the wall behind it. They moved like a tide, stripping the fortress of its fangs before the Axis even understood what was happening. Within minutes, the sky above Vardoon that had once been theirs was no longer theirs at all. It belonged to the swarm. When the black ships revealed themselves, they did not roar into view. They simply appeared, sliding out of shadow with their matte hulls drinking in the light. They had been waiting at the edges of sight, folded into routes no one had thought possible. Now they closed in and dropped their payloads. Marines fell through the thin air like streaks of steel. Not fire, not bombs, not destruction, but soldiers with purpose. They moved through the fortress with a silence that terrified more than any scream. Door by door they advanced, disabling systems, securing halls, binding prisoners without cruelty, but with no hesitation. The Axis defenders fought, but they fought blind. They fired into corners where no enemy stood. They swung against walls that yielded nothing. Every time they turned, they found themselves outflanked, every move predicted. For 63 minutes the battle ran, and when it ended, the fortress of Vardoon stood intact, but in human hands. No civilian had been harmed. Hospitals still held their patients, families still sat at their tables, the markets within the fortress still had their goods stacked on shelves. Only the weapons were gone. Only the commanders sat in chains. The galaxy could not understand it. They had expected blood rivers, fire, and vengeance. Instead, they saw a war fought like surgery. Every cut exact, every strike measured. It was war, but it was also discipline. The news spread, and with it came disbelief. Some claimed the Axis had faked their defeat to lure sympathy. Others said humans had used forbidden technology. Yet even the recordings from neutral observers confirmed what had happened. They showed human Marines moving like ghosts. They showed drones dismantling, Weapons with precision that bordered on art. They showed captains alive in chains, not corpses left for the wind. The truth was undeniable, and it shook the galaxy more than any massacre ever could. In the Concord Hall, Mara Hale stood once again. She placed the recordings on the pedestal and let the delegates see them with their own eyes. She did not gloat, she did not thunder. She spoke simply. Humanity warned that its patience was not endless. That warning has been answered with action. Vardoon has fallen, not burned, but taken whole and intact. Its leaders live, and they will face law, not slaughter. Humanity does not fight to destroy, but to enforce the line that was crossed. The Dalian chorus rose into a low harmonic that trembled through the chamber. It was the sound they made only for things that marked the turning of ages. Neutral blocks who had once scoffed at humans now whispered that perhaps law did not only live in words, but in the ability to act on them. The Axis envoys screamed of treachery, of hidden weapons, of impossible deceit, but no one listened. Their fortress was gone, their fleet stranded, their pride broken. Back on Earth, the bells tolled again. Families lit more candles and children learned new songs. Songs about patience that was not weakness. Songs about lines that meant something. The galaxy watched, and for the first time in generations they began to believe that humans who had been mocked for restraint might yet reshape the very order of the stars. It was not the fall of a fortress alone. It was the fall of an illusion and the rise of something the galaxy had not yet found a name for. Mara Hale returned to the Concord after the fall of Vardoon, not as an envoy who asked, but as the voice of a people who had delivered. She entered the chamber with the same calm walk and the same hands folded behind her back. But the hall was different now. Delegates who once smirked in their tears leaned forward with quiet eyes. The Dalian chorus hummed a rising note of recognition, and even the crystal chair gave off a faint glow, as if sensing that the balance had shifted. Mara carried no weapon, but the pedestal in front of her became sharper than any blade when she placed the records from Vardoon on. Its surface images filled the air above her: human marines escorting civilians, unharmed markets, untouched commanders alive, but bound and charged with crimes. The message was not of destruction, but of control. Humanity had proven that patience had ended, yet mercy still walked beside it. She spoke in clear words: Earth has not come to demand vengeance, Earth has come to demand law. The line was crossed and our answer was measured. It will remain measured so long as reason prevails. She offered terms, not surrender, but boundaries. She called for reparations to repay the convoys that had been seized. She demanded a new charter written with teeth so that sacred marks like the Blue Lantern could never again be ignored. She asked for oversight by neutrals and for accountability for Axis leaders whose arrogance had endangered every traveler in the stars. She did not say that humans could burn fleets and topple worlds. She did not need to say it. The memory of Vardoon whispered it for her. The neutral blocks listened with heavy attention. For years they had feared that any species strong enough to challenge the Axis would unleash ruin. Yet what they saw in the humans was something different. Strength bound by discipline. Power guided by restraint. The Dalian chorus voiced their agreement in harmonics that carried across the chamber, sounding almost like mourning, but also like hope. They said that a people who wielded force without cruelty might finally bring balance to the conquered. Others nodded and murmured support because they could see that humanity had set its terms in clarity. Not in rage, but not all in the chamber wanted peace. The Axis envoys seethed at their podium. They called Mara a liar. They claimed the recordings had been staged. They demanded that Vardoon be returned to them, that their commanders be freed. They accused humans of hiding forbidden weapons and breaking ancient codes. Their words dripped with venom, yet even their closest allies shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the evidence with their own eyes. They had felt the silence of an entire world that had answered insult with precision, not fire. The Axis words sounded hollow against that reality. Still, the most zealous among them were not ready to bend in secret. They plotted a last strike, something reckless that might turn fear back into control. They told themselves that humans had shown mercy because they could not show total strength. They told themselves that the discipline was disguise. They would gamble everything on proving humanity was still fragile. But for the moment in the conquered, their voices were drowned by the weight of what had been revealed. Mara Hale stood firm and unmoved. She had delivered the terms, and she would not retract them. Outside the chamber, the galaxy itself shifted. Merchants began to reroute their trade through human lanes because those lanes were now the safest. Farmers in distant colonies whispered thanks because their convoys would now carry food without fear. Miners who had lost kin to Axis raids lit lamps in remembrance and swore they would never again doubt the patience of Earth. Neutral reporters spread the images of Vardoon across the stars, and common citizens who had never seen a human before began to speak the name with respect, not scorn, on Earth. The bells rang again, not for war but for reckoning. Families gathered in squares to listen to the announcements broadcast from the conquered. They heard Mara's voice carry across the ocean, speaking of reparations and charters and justice, not conquest. They stood in silence as the words reached them, and when the message ended, they clapped hands together, not in triumph, but in agreement that the line once crossed had been answered, and that from this moment forward no one could pretend humanity was small. Yet even as the hope spread, the Axis zealots sharpened their knives. Their fleets were wounded, their pride shattered, but desperation can be as dangerous as strength. They began to plan a strike that would reach for the heart of Earth itself. They would gamble on speed and deceit. They would gamble that humans, though powerful, could still be broken if caught unguarded. The Concord did not know of these whispers, yet but humanity did. Humanity had watched too long and learned too well to be caught by surprise. The stage was set, and every star seemed to wait to see whether reason would prevail or whether the zealots would hurl the galaxy into one last blaze of defiance. The zealots of the Axis moved in secret, yet secrecy had never been their gift. They carried too much arrogance and too much fury to truly hide. Their plan was reckless and brutal. They would strike at the foundries of Earth's moon, the heart of human fleet construction where dry docks floated like iron cities above the silver surface. If they could shatter those yards, they believed humanity's strength would crumble back into myth. Their agents whispered through back channels, and they gathered remnants of fleets that had escaped the blackout of human cyber war. They masked their signals. They bent their ships through broken lanes, and with a desperation that bordered on madness, they hurled themselves toward the system that had birthed their enemies. The strike began in the dark of a lunar night. The foundries glowed faintly against the stars. Massive frameworks where hulls were hammered together, and drones danced like sparks around half-built ships. The Axis fleet fell, upon them with weapons screaming. They launched volleys meant to tear the yards into fragments and scatter them across the void. They broadcast their assault, live across the conquered. They wanted the galaxy to see Earth humbled, to see humanity bleed. The first blasts tore through scaffolds and shattered empty shells, but the attackers did not know that they had already been seen. Long before their engines had entered range, human watchers hidden in the deep nets of space had marked their approach. Within minutes, the answer came. It did not come with a roar of revenge. It came with clarity. A swarm of interceptors rose from the shadow of the Earth itself, moving faster than the Axis had imagined possible. They cut through the attackers like razors, slicing engines clean away, disabling ships without ripping them apart. The black ships followed, sliding from the dark, with precision strikes, boarding pods latching on like steel barnacles. Marines surged through the decks of Axis vessels, not with slaughter, but with control, locking down corridors, severing command, and seizing weapons. In 12 minutes, the strike that was meant to cripple Earth had failed utterly. Axis ships hung dead in space, their crews bound, their weapons silent. The galaxy watched the broadcast turn from pride to humiliation. The human answer did not stop at victory. For the first time since the line had been crossed, humanity showed the galaxy its heart. The survivors of the Axis crews were gathered alive, and their images were broadcast not as trophies but as proof of a choice humanity had not answered with apocalypse. They could have destroyed every ship, every captain, every trace of the zealot strike. Instead, they showed the galaxy something older than vengeance. They showed the families of the seized convoy alive, rescued from Axis cells. They showed children smiling again. They showed workers from the relief ships standing proud. They let the galaxy see that when Earth fought, It was not for dominance or greed, but to keep promises made long ago. Then came the oath. Every human spacer knows it, and every recruit learns it before they ever set foot on a deck. It was broadcast in clear voices across every channel, not just to allies, not just to neutrals, but even to the Axis. The words were simple. We will never start the fire, but we will finish it. And with those words, the galaxy felt something shift. Entire worlds that had feared humanity began to trust that strength bound by such an oath could protect as much as it could punish. Even the Dalian chorus lifted their harmonics into something bright, not mourning this time, but a chord of hope. The Zealots had gambled everything on breaking the myth of humanity. Instead, they had cemented it. The attempt on the moon yards became a story of failure, told in hushed tones. A reminder that desperation without wisdom leads only to ruin. The Axis had thrown its last dice and lost. Humanity had not only survived the strike, it had turned the moment into proof of its discipline and its mercy. Across the stars, people began to whisper that perhaps the time of human patience snapping was not only a time of fear, but a time of change. The galaxy had seen force restrained by choice, and in that choice there was something stronger than terror. There was the beginning of respect that could not be forgotten. The Concord chamber filled again with voices, but this time they carried a different weight. The fall of Vardun had shattered the illusion of Axis invulnerability, and the failed strike on the moon yards had ended their gamble. The Zealots sat broken and silent at their benches, while neutral delegates pressed forward with urgency. They had seen enough to understand what the new balance meant. The chair summoned order, and Mara Hale stepped into the circle for what would be the last time in this long struggle. She looked no different. Calm, steady, her hands folded as always. But the hall listened now, not out of curiosity or contempt, but out of respect. She began by recalling what had happened, not with anger but with clarity. Relief convoys seized against every law, fortress worlds turned into prisons. The sacred blue lantern mocked before the eyes of the galaxy. Then, she spoke of the human answer. Fleets blinded without slaughter, fortresses taken without massacre, children rescued without vengeance. She did not promise that humanity would forgive easily. She promised only that they would not allow it to happen. Again, her voice carried not thunder but something sharper, the calm of a decision that could not be undone. The terms were laid out again, boundaries that would not be crossed, reparations to repay what had been stolen, a new Concord charter that would give power to enforce its laws, not only to write them. She placed documents of evidence before the delegates, recordings of Axis crimes, the rescued survivors, the families reunited. No one in the chamber could deny them. The neutral blocs voted with overwhelming support. Even species that had once turned their backs on humanity raised their voices in agreement. The Dalian chorus rose in harmony like a bell that rang across every system. They declared that the age of patient waiting had ended, and that a new order had begun, one that no species would ever forget. The Axis surrendered what was left of its leadership. Some were placed on trial, others stripped of command, their fleets disbanded. Common citizens of their worlds cheered quietly, not for punishment but for the end of endless pride that had bled them for years. For the first time in a generation, merchants could speak of open lanes, farmers of safe harvests, miners of trade without tribute. The stars seemed to breathe again, and the conquered signed the charter that marked a turning point, written with the scars of what had come before, and the promise of what would follow. Mara Hale did not stay to bask in the applause. She returned to the colony of Thessaly, where the children of the seized convoy were waiting. The settlement was simple domes of glass and soil gardens that smelled of new growth. Families had gathered in the square to greet her. She knelt among the children and gave them the same calm smile she had worn in the Concord. She told them that patience was not weakness, and that promises mattered more than pride. She told them they had lived through fear, but they would grow in peace. She placed the small pebble she had carried for years into the soil of the colony, and said quietly that this was the place beyond fear she had been asked to find. The galaxy recorded that moment, not with the glare of war, but with the quiet of memory. It was not the fall of Vardoon or the strike on the moon, yards that became the lasting image. It was a human envoy kneeling among children on a small world, reminding them that strength without compassion is only another chain, and that true power lies in keeping the promises you make. Humanity's patience had snapped, and the answer had been swift, but what remained was not ruin. What remained was a new respect carved into the very fabric of the stars. Across the conquered worlds, they whispered that no species would ever forget the day patience ended and the galaxy changed. For some, it was fear; for others, relief; but for all, it was unforgettable. The bells of Earth rang one last time, not as a warning, but as a call to remembrance. And as Mara Hale walked through the colony streets with the rescued children at her side, she knew that the story was complete. The galaxy would remember not only the strike of human power, but the steady hand that held it back. The day humanity's patience snapped would forever echo as the day the stars learned to measure strength not in cruelty but in resolve. The galaxy held its breath as the echoes of war faded, and the silence left in its wake carried a weight heavier than any fleet could bear. Humanity stood at the edge of known space, not as conquerors but as a reminder that patience has a limit that even the most advanced civilizations must respect. Across the star lanes, the survivors of countless worlds whispered tales of humans who had endured attacks without retaliation for centuries. But when the HFY breaking point came, they responded with a force measured not in mindless destruction but in undeniable precision. Their ships glided through the void like predators of old, hunting with strategy unmatched by any other species. Every move calculated, every strike purposeful yet sparing of those who had not earned wrath on the world of Thessaly. The children who had been rescued gathered around Mara Hale as she shared stories of resilience and courage. Her voice carried the weight of generations, and her eyes reflected a calm fury that no enemy could ever provoke again. The colony had grown from simple domes to thriving settlements filled with laughter and learning. Humans were teaching the young from every species the principles that had carried them through eons of trials, discipline, honor, and the knowledge that true power lies in restraint as much as in strength. The galaxy began to shift under the influence of these teachings, and the echoes of fear, once associated with humanity, transformed into respect and cautious admiration. Across systems, the Axis remnants and other hostile species reevaluated their strategies. They realized that humans were not just unpredictable, but unstoppable when provoked. Their leaders spoke in hushed tones of the fleets that had vanished without a trace of civilian blood, the fortresses that had surrendered without a fight, and the diplomacy that had ensured survival while enforcing consequences simultaneously. The word spread from one system to the next that no species would ever forget the moment humanity's patience finally snapped, and that those who tested it would pay dearly, whether through loss of pride, resources, or freedom. Mara Hale watched the stars from the command bridge of the flagship as reports came in from every corner of the galaxy. Each message was a testament to survival and growth, communities rebuilt, alliances forged, and enemies humbled. She allowed herself a rare moment of reflection, knowing that the calm after the storm was not the absence of danger but the presence of understanding, that humanity had won not just through strength, but through the moral clarity that guided their actions. Every pulse of the engines beneath her feet seemed to resonate with the promise that no matter the challenge, humanity would endure and prevail as they always had. The final Concord sessions were held in orbit of the neutral world of Illyria, where delegates signed a charter that would bind all species to the principles that had emerged from humanity's decisive actions. The treaties forbade surprise attacks, mass destruction of civilian populations, and betrayal of agreed terms, ensuring that patience and honor would be respected even in conflict. The galaxy learned that true power is tempered by justice, and that the memory of one species' restraint followed by action could reshape millennia of conflict into an era of cautious but real peace. As Mara Hale descended to the surface of Thessaly, the colony erupted in celebration. The children ran through gardens that stretched beneath artificial suns, their laughter echoing across the biodomes. Humans and allied species worked side by side, planting seeds that would grow into the future, reminding everyone that strength alone is fleeting, but the wisdom to wield it is eternal. The stars above shimmered as if acknowledging that humanity had not only survived, but had etched a permanent mark on the consciousness of the galaxy. The moment patience ended had become legend, and the echoes of that day would resonate for generations to come. The end.